decades, investigators relied on patterns of behavior, patterns of geography, patterns of escalation. Serial killers, they believed, were creatures of habit. They hunted familiar ground. They returned to places they knew. They repeated themselves. And for the most part, they were right. But then there was one man who understood this better than anyone else. He understood that patterns were not a mistake. They were the trap. And so he designed his life around avoiding them. Different states, different victims, different methods, years between crimes, no signature, no rhythm, no story for police to follow. For a long time, law enforcement didn't even realize he existed. And by the time they did, he had already buried what he needed to keep killing. His name was Israel Keyes. And this is the story of how close he came to never being found at all. Madness&Macabre. Before anyone knew his name, before investigators ever realized there was a single person connecting anything at all, Israel Keyes was already practicing how to disappear in plain sight. Not physically, not dramatically, socially. Keyes understood something early in his life that most people never stop to think about. That being noticed is not the same thing as being seen. And being seen, truly seen, is dangerous if you don't want questions asked. So he made himself unremarkable. He didn't dress to attract attention. He didn't speak unless he needed to. He didn't argue loudly. He didn't drink himself into scenes he couldn't remember. If you passed him in a grocery store, you wouldn't remember his face. If you worked next to him for months, you wouldn't remember anything specific he'd ever said. If he lived next door, you'd remember the house, but not the man. That wasn't coincidence. That was discipline. Israel Keyes grew up moving from place to place, raised in an environment where isolation was normal and authority was something to be avoided rather than respected. He learned early how to exist without drawing scrutiny, how to stay within the edges of expectation without ever stepping into the center of attention. He didn't rebel in obvious ways. He didn't lash out publicly. He didn't fail loudly. Instead, he learned to compartmentalize. There was the version of himself that existed in public, quiet, compliant, ordinary. And then there was everything else. As an adult, Keyes built a life that looked stable from the outside. He worked construction. He fixed things. He showed up on time. He paid rent. He paid bills. He participated just enough to be left alone. He had relationships. He had a child. He lived in neighborhoods where nothing interesting ever seemed to happen. The kind of places police rarely drove through unless they had a reason. And that was the point. Keyes didn't need chaos around him. Chaos was noisy. Chaos attracted attention. Chaos left witnesses who remembered details they didn't realize mattered. What he needed was neutrality. A life that blended into the background so completely that it erased itself. People later described him as quiet. Some said polite. Others said reserved. No one said dangerous. No one said unsettling. Because nothing about him demanded emotional engagement. He wasn't charming. He wasn't threatening. He wasn't memorable. He existed in the negative space of other people's lives. And that made him invisible. What most people don't understand is that serial offenders don't fail because they lack intelligence. They fail because they crave something: recognition, control, emotional release. And that craving creates patterns. Patterns are readable. Keyes knew this. He didn't want the thrill of being known. He didn't want notoriety. He didn't want headlines. He wanted freedom of movement, so he avoided habits the way others avoid danger. He didn't return to places that mattered. He didn't talk about his inner life. He didn't anchor himself emotionally to locations. He traveled constantly, but not impulsively. Flights were planned. Routes were indirect. Destinations were temporary. To anyone watching casually, it looked like restlessness. To someone paying attention, it would have looked like strategy. But no one was paying attention. At least, not yet. What made Keyes particularly difficult to detect wasn't just that he moved. Plenty of people move. Plenty of people travel for work. Plenty of people cross state lines without leaving traces worth noticing. What made him different was that he designed his movement to resist reconstruction. If someone tried to look backward through his life, to chart where he had been, why he had been there, and what he had done, they would find gaps. Not dramatic gaps, not suspicious absences, just nothing. Entire weeks that left no impression. Trips with no obvious purpose. Journeys that didn't resolve into stories. Most people, when they travel, leave narratives behind. They tell co-workers where they went. They take photos. They complain about delays. They bring something back. Keyes did none of that. He returned quietly, went back to work, resumed routine, as if nothing had happened, as if he had never left. This wasn't accidental. Keyes believed that memory itself was a vulnerability, that if you could remove yourself from other people's stories, you could move without consequence. And so he trained himself to be forgettable. Even among people who knew him well, there were limits. Conversation stayed shallow. Emotional disclosure was minimal. He listened more than he spoke. He asked questions without answering them in return. He didn't argue. He didn't confess. He didn't explain. And because of that, no one ever felt like they truly knew him, which meant no one ever felt the absence of knowledge. When investigators later tried to reconstruct his life, they found something deeply unsettling. There were no emotional landmarks. No periods where people said, "That's when he changed." No obvious moments of escalation. No stories that pointed toward darkness. He didn't spiral outward. He folded inward. And inside that inward space he planned. Not crimes yet. Logistics, timeframes, travel patterns. What drew attention, what didn't. He learned where cameras were common, where police response was slow, where terrain swallowed sound. He learned which towns barely noticed strangers, which roads were empty at night, which areas were passed through but never remembered. This was not the behavior of someone acting on impulse. This was someone constructing a system designed not to get away with something once, but to operate indefinitely. And that's what made him dangerous long before he ever killed, because by the time he did, the groundwork had already been laid. The anonymity was already in place. The silence was already built into his life. To neighbors, he was just another man coming home after work. To co-workers, he was dependable and quiet. To family, present but distant. And to law enforcement, he didn't exist at all, not yet. Because at this stage, there was nothing to connect, nothing to notice, nothing to chase. Only a man living an ordinary life, moving through the world without friction, building something invisible beneath the surface. Something that wouldn't be discovered until much later, when it was already far too late. Long before the crimes that would later bring his name into the public record, Israel Keyes was already preparing for violence in a way that defied almost every assumption investigators relied on. Most killers plan close to the moment. They buy what they need when the urge is present. They act when the pressure builds. Keyes believed that urgency was a flaw. Urgency created witnesses. Urgency created receipts. Urgency created memory. So he removed it from the equation entirely. Instead of reacting to impulse, he planned years in advance. He traveled not to kill, but to prepare. In remote areas across the country, often far from where he lived, and far from where he would eventually commit crimes. Keyes buried what would later be referred to as kill kits. They were not symbolic. They were not theatrical. They were practical. Buckets, containers, packages sealed against moisture and decay. Inside them were tools selected for function, not speed. Weapons chosen not for noise, but for control. Items that could be retrieved quietly, used efficiently, and abandoned without regret. And then he left them there, sometimes for years. There is something deeply unsettling about this kind of preparation, not because of the violence it enables, but because of the patience it requires. To bury a kit and walk away means accepting uncertainty. It means trusting that no one will stumble across it, that the landscape will remain unchanged. That time itself won't interfere. It requires faith in silence. Keyes placed these kits near hiking trails, in forests, in areas people pass through but never examine closely. Places where the ground was disturbed often enough to seem natural, but not enough to be searched. He didn't mark them with obvious signs. He didn't return to check on them frequently. He let them disappear into the environment, and then he went back to living his life. This separation between preparation and action was intentional. If police ever questioned him after a crime, there would be nothing in his immediate history to connect him to it. No recent purchases, no sudden trips, no last-minute changes in behavior. The tools would already be there, waiting. What makes this approach so difficult to counter is that it turns time into a weapon. Investigators often look backward from a crime scene, searching for recent movements, recent decisions, recent stressors. Keyes understood this. By spacing his preparation far away from the act itself, he created distance not just geographically, but causally. The cause and the effect no longer lived in the same moment, and that broke the narrative chain police depended on. Even if someone suspected him, which they didn't, there would be nothing obvious to point to. No evidence trail beginning at the moment of violence, because the trail had started years earlier and ended underground. These kits also allowed Keyes to do something most serial offenders never manage, to remain flexible. He didn't commit to a specific victim. He didn't commit to a specific date. He didn't even commit to a specific crime. He committed to capability. When the moment felt right, when the opportunity presented itself, when conditions aligned, he could act, or not. And if he chose not to, nothing was lost. The kit remained buried. The preparation remained intact. The future stayed open. This wasn't obsession. It was infrastructure. Keyes believed that by separating preparation from desire, he could outlast both, that he could live normally, even peacefully, until the moment arrived, and then step briefly into violence before disappearing again. And for a time, he succeeded. There were kits he never used, kits investigators later found that appeared untouched, waiting as if the person who buried them might return at any moment. Which raises an uncomfortable question. How many times did he stand near one of these buried containers and decide to walk away? How many potential crimes never happened? Not because of morality, but because the timing wasn't perfect. That restraint is what made him so difficult to detect. Keyes did not escalate quickly. He did not spiral. He paused. And pauses don't show up in police data. There is also something else that these kids reveal about how he thought. They were buried far from his home, far from places he was emotionally connected to. Keyes understood that familiarity breeds attachment, and attachment breeds risk. If he felt connected to a location, he avoided it. If a place mattered to him, it was off limits. Instead, he chose spaces that meant nothing. Anonymous forests, interstate towns, places that existed only as coordinates. This allowed him to leave without reflection, no revisiting, no reminiscing, no compulsion to return. Most killers revisit their scenes. Keyes believed that was sentimental. Sentiment left traces. He didn't want reminders. He didn't want souvenirs. He wanted erasure. When law enforcement later began uncovering these kids, they realized something terrifying. There was no way to know how many existed. Some may still be buried. Some may have decayed. Some may never be found. Each one represented not just a crime, but a possibility. A moment where violence had been prepared for and simply postponed. And that is what separated Israel Keyes from many others like him. He didn't live in the act. He lived in the waiting. The kids were not trophies. They were not memories. They were proof that he believed he could step in and out of violence at will, without consequence, without identity, without leaving anything behind. And for years, that belief went unchallenged. No one noticed the ground had been disturbed. No one questioned why it was there. No one connected one forest to another, because there was nothing to connect, just empty land and time. When investigators eventually pieced together what these kids meant, they weren't just looking at evidence of crimes already committed. They were looking at a blueprint, a system designed to function indefinitely, and it forced them to confront a reality they didn't want to accept. That if one small decision had gone differently, if one moment had passed without deviation, Israel Keyes might never have been caught at all, and the ground might still be holding his secrets. He moved through daily life without visible disruption. This normalcy was disarming. People expect guilt to leak out, to show itself in micro-behaviors, to create tension others can sense. Keyes kept everything compartmentalized. There was a time for violence, and there was a time for life, and he never let the two overlap. So when law enforcement looked for stress fractures, they found none. No co-workers reported sudden changes. No neighbors noticed unusual activity. No family members described a shift. There was no before and after, only continuity. Which is why, for years, investigators weren't missing him. They weren't even looking for him. Because the framework they relied on, the idea that serial killers reveal themselves through repetition, simply didn't apply. Keyes had removed himself from the system by refusing to play the role the system expected. And as long as he stayed disciplined, as long as he resisted comfort, as long as he avoided the temptation to simplify, he remained invisible. But invisibility comes at a cost, because maintaining that level of control requires constant vigilance. And eventually, vigilance becomes exhausting. And exhaustion leads to mistakes. Mistakes don't always look like panic. They don't always look like chaos. Sometimes they look like confidence. And that confidence is what finally exposed him. For a long time, Israel Keyes believed he had solved the problem that undid every killer before him. He believed he had removed the weak points. No pattern, no escalation, no emotional leakage. From his perspective, nothing was slipping. And that belief, the belief that a system is flawless, is where danger begins. Control, when it works, doesn't feel dramatic. It feels calm, routine. It feels like nothing happening at all. Keyes lived in that calm. After each act of violence, he returned to ordinary life without disruption. He didn't isolate himself afterward. He didn't self-destruct. He didn't chase adrenaline. Instead, he settled back into routine as if nothing had occurred. That was the feedback loop. Nothing went wrong. Nothing drew attention. Nothing followed him home. And so the conclusion felt obvious. The system worked. Over time, this success hardened into confidence. Not arrogance, not outwardly, but certainty. Certainty that the precautions were sufficient. Certainty that patience was protection. Certainty that the world remained blind. He began to trust his own structure more than chance. And that trust subtly changed how he moved through the world. Not in visible ways, not in ways others would notice, but internally. The constant vigilance that once governed every decision began to relax. Not completely, but enough. He didn't abandon discipline. He refined it. And refinement is where rigidity begins. Keyes believed he had mastered separation, that he could keep his violent self sealed away from his domestic life indefinitely. But separation isn't permanent. It requires maintenance, and maintenance requires energy. Over time, the mental cost of sustaining two completely isolated realities grows heavier. The effort required to remember what cannot be shared, to remain emotionally neutral, to avoid attachment, to never speak freely, creates pressure. Pressure looks for release. For many offenders, that release is escalation. For others, confession. For Keyes, it was optimization. He began thinking not just about how to avoid detection, but how to make the process more efficient. Less movement, less waiting, less distance. Not enough to be obvious, just enough to feel easier. He didn't consciously think, I'm getting sloppy. He thought, I've earned this. Years without consequence have a way of rewriting risk. The absence of punishment begins to feel like proof of invincibility, and that belief is seductive. Keyes also began to experience something else he had tried to eliminate entirely: familiarity. He had always avoided forming attachments to locations, always treated places as interchangeable, but familiarity crept in anyway, with routines, with travel patterns, with confidence in certain environments. And familiarity dulls caution. When something hasn't gone wrong for a long time, the mind quietly adjusts expectations. It stops treating danger as immediate. It begins to assume continuity. Keyes believed his discipline would protect him indefinitely, but discipline without humility becomes brittle. Another factor in this illusion of control was isolation. Keyes didn't talk to anyone about what he was doing. There was no external check, no voice pushing back against his assumptions. Everything existed inside his own reasoning, and reasoning unchallenged becomes circular. He believed he was careful because he had been careful before. He believed he was invisible because he hadn't been seen. He believed the system worked because it hadn't failed. Each belief reinforced the next. This is the moment where inevitability enters the story, because no system that relies entirely on one person's judgment survives indefinitely. Eventually, fatigue sets in. Eventually, context shifts. Eventually, variables change, and the system doesn't adapt fast enough. What makes this stage particularly unsettling is that nothing appears wrong from the outside. Keyes wasn't unraveling. He wasn't desperate. He wasn't cornered. He was comfortable. Comfort is dangerous. It invites shortcuts. It invites assumptions. It invites the belief that consequences are abstract. And when consequences feel abstract, decisions change. The mistake that would eventually expose him didn't come from panic or error. It came from confidence, from believing that one small deviation wouldn't matter, that one rule could bend without breaking, because until that moment, every rule had held. Keyes believed control meant predictability, but control, in the end, is an illusion, because the world doesn't care how carefully you plan. It only cares whether you slip. And once that illusion cracks, once reality pushes back even slightly, the entire structure begins to destabilize. The system Keyes built wasn't undone by chaos. It was undone by certainty, by the belief that nothing could touch him. And that belief set the stage for the moment everything changed. Because the more you trust the system, the less you question it. And eventually, you stop noticing the line you're about to cross. The mistake did not arrive suddenly. It didn't announce itself. It didn't feel dangerous. It didn't feel like failure. That is why it mattered. By the time Israel Keyes reached this point, he had spent years proving to himself that discipline was enough, that patience was enough, that distance was enough, and most importantly, that silence was enough. The system had held. So when the deviation came, it didn't feel like a risk. It felt like a minor adjustment. Keyes had always believed that movement was safety, that disappearing after an act, physically and psychologically, was essential. He believed that the longer he stayed in one place, the more exposed he became. But this time, he stayed. Not long enough to feel reckless, not long enough to feel trapped, just long enough to feel present. And presence changes things. For the first time, he allowed himself to interact with the aftermath instead of vanishing from it. Not emotionally, but logistically. He made a decision he had avoided his entire life. He communicated. The choice to ask for ransom was not impulsive. It wasn't made in panic. It wasn't made because he needed attention. It was made because in his mind, it fit the system. Money was transactional, neutral, clean. He believed he could treat it the same way he treated everything else, as a problem to be managed, not an emotion to be indulged. He believed he could control it. But communication is different. Communication creates direction. Direction creates traceability. Traceability creates connection, even when handled carefully. Keyes believed he could stay ahead of that chain, that by choosing the right timing, the right method, the right level of distance, he could still remain invisible. And for a moment, it seemed like he was right. The early movements didn't set off alarms. Nothing immediately pointed back to him. No one was watching closely. But something had changed. For the first time, his actions left a footprint that existed outside his own control. A record, a transaction, a moment that could be revisited. Unlike buried kits or long-forgotten travel routes, this action lived in systems he did not command. Cameras, logs, databases, places where time doesn't erase itself. Keyes had spent years removing himself from narratives, from stories, from sequences investigators could follow. This time, he added a chapter. And once a story exists, it can be traced. The withdrawal itself was small, ordinary, one of thousands that happened every day. But small things accumulate, and accumulation is what he had avoided at all costs. The mistake wasn't that he used an ATM. The mistake was believing that one visible action wouldn't matter in a life built entirely around invisibility. He had convinced himself that randomness was protection, that because nothing had gone wrong before, nothing would go wrong now. This is where confidence becomes blindness, because the world doesn't react to intention. It reacts to evidence, and evidence doesn't care how careful you've been up until now. From the outside, the decision looked minor, even logical. From the inside, it felt controlled. But control is fragile when it depends on perfection, and perfection is unsustainable. Keyes didn't realize immediately that something had shifted. There was no instant consequence, no sirens, no confrontation. The world did not collapse around him. Instead, something much quieter happened. Attention turned. Somewhere, a process began. Not fast, not dramatic, just forward. And that forward motion was enough. The mistake wasn't the crime. It wasn't the method. It wasn't even the decision itself. The mistake was allowing himself to be part of the sequence, to create continuity, to stay just a little too close. For years, he had treated distance as armor. Now, for the first time, he stepped out of it. And once that happened, the system he built, the one that relied on separation, patience, and silence, had no way to protect him, because systems don't fail all at once. They fail at the point of deviation. And this deviation, however small it felt at the time, was enough to expose him to something he had avoided his entire life. A trail. Trails don't appear all at once. They don't announce themselves. They don't glow. They form quietly, through alignment. A moment here, a record there. Two unrelated facts that, when placed side by side, refuse to stay separate. For years, Israel Keyes had built his life around preventing that alignment. He scattered his actions across time and space, trusting that distance would dissolve meaning. But distance only works when nothing connects the pieces. This time, something did. The transaction was reviewed not because it was extraordinary, but because it existed. It could be replayed, rewound, frozen. Surveillance footage doesn't forget. It doesn't care how ordinary a moment feels to the person living it. It captures posture, timing, direction. A man approaching an ATM, a car pulling away, a face that didn't know it was being preserved. At first, it was just a fragment, a few seconds of video, a timestamp, a location. On its own, it meant nothing. But investigations rarely rely on single moments. They rely on accumulation, on the quiet process of ruling out everything that doesn't fit until only one shape remains. The footage was examined alongside other details, not because investigators knew who they were looking for, but because they finally had something to look at. The direction of travel mattered, the timing mattered, the behavior mattered. And once behavior enters the equation, movement becomes traceable. Airports keep records. Car rentals keep logs. Hotels keep timestamps. None of these systems were designed to catch someone like Keyes, but none of them were designed to be ignored forever either. As the investigators began mapping movements backward and forward from that moment, a pattern, not of violence, but of travel, began to emerge. A man who moved frequently, across long distances, often alone. At first, it looked like coincidence. Plenty of people travel. Plenty of people pass through airports anonymously. But coincidence loses credibility when it repeats. The same individual appearing at key points, always nearby, always just outside the frame. The trail didn't lead directly to a crime scene. It led to proximity, and proximity is enough to ask questions. This is the stage where investigations change tone. Not urgency, not certainty, curiosity. Someone noticed that the movements lined up too cleanly to dismiss, that the timing wasn't random, that the direction of travel suggested intent rather than chance. And once intent is suspected, everything is re-examined. Past trips, old records, routine behaviors that once felt meaningless. Keyes had relied on fragmentation, on the idea that no one would ever have reason to look at his movements as a whole. But now, for the first time, someone was doing exactly that. This didn't happen quickly. There was no dramatic breakthrough. It was slow, deliberate. Investigators followed procedure, checked assumptions, verified data. They didn't know yet that they were closing in on a serial offender. They only knew that something didn't sit right. That instinct, the sense that details don't align, is often the most dangerous thing for someone who relies on invisibility. Because instincts don't need proof to begin. They only need inconsistency. And once investigators suspect inconsistency, they don't stop looking. They widen the frame. The more they widened it, the more they saw. Trips that didn't line up with work schedules. Routes that made no economic sense. Movements that suggested planning rather than spontaneity. Each piece alone was harmless. Together, they suggested structure. And structure is the opposite of randomness. Keyes had believed that by avoiding repetition in violence, he could avoid detection entirely. But he underestimated something. You don't need to repeat a crime to repeat behavior. Movement itself becomes a signature if it's intentional enough. And intention leaves traces. As the trail lengthened, law enforcement didn't rush to confrontation. They watched. Watching is powerful. It allows patterns to reveal themselves naturally. It allows the subject to continue moving, unaware that the landscape has changed. Keyes continued his life as usual. He traveled, he returned, he blended back into routine. From his perspective, nothing had happened. From theirs, everything had begun. Eventually, the trail narrowed, not to a suspect list, to a name. And names change everything. Once a name exists, past and present collapse into the same space. Records are no longer abstract. They belong to someone. That someone can be followed, observed, stopped. The arrest, when it came, was quiet. No spectacle, no resistance. Just a moment where motion ceased. For the first time in years, Israel Keyes was no longer moving freely. And that was enough, because the trail didn't need to prove everything. It only needed to prove something. Something real, something visible, something undeniable. The system he built had relied on staying ahead of attention. Now, attention had caught up. And once that happens, control becomes theoretical. Because the world has finally begun to look back. Movement ended quietly. There was no chase, no dramatic confrontation, no moment that looked like justice, just a door closing. For the first time in years, Israel Keyes was no longer in transit, no longer choosing when to arrive or when to leave, no longer deciding which direction to take. He was seated. The interrogation room is designed to do something very specific. It removes variables, no scenery, no distractions, no escape routes disguised as choices, just walls, a table, chairs, and time. For most people, that stillness is unbearable. The mind looks for exits that aren't there. Silence becomes pressure. Pressure becomes speech. But Keyes had trained for silence. He had lived inside it for years. When investigators first sat across from him, they didn't see panic. They didn't see collapse. They didn't see the frantic energy that often follows arrest. They saw control, measured responses, even breathing. A man who appeared to understand exactly where he was. That composure mattered, because interrogation isn't about information at first. It's about imbalance. Detectives aren't looking for confessions right away. They're looking for reactions, for moments where certainty flickers, for cracks in posture, tone, timing. Keyes gave them very little. He answered questions without expanding. He acknowledged facts without elaboration. He listened carefully. Listening is powerful in a room like that. It shifts momentum. Keyes believed that by limiting what he gave, he could preserve the same distance that had protected him for years. That even now, especially now, he could remain compartmentalized. And for a time, it seemed like he could. But interrogation rooms change people, even when they don't look like they are, because they collapse context. There is no past in that room, only what is spoken, no future, only what might be revealed. And the longer someone sits there, the more their internal structure begins to strain. Investigators noticed something subtle. Keyes wasn't nervous about being caught. He was cautious about being understood. That distinction mattered. He wasn't afraid of punishment. He was afraid of exposure, of someone reconstructing the system he had spent years building. So he tried to control the narrative the only way he knew how, by rationing truth. He spoke in fragments. He admitted selectively. He hinted without confirming. Every piece he offered felt calculated, as if he believed that by choosing which truth to reveal, he could still shape the outcome. But interrogation doesn't reward control. It rewards inconsistency. And inconsistencies began to appear, not in what he said, but in how he framed it. Keyes wanted to be precise, but precision invites verification. Every specific detail can be checked. Every admission becomes an anchor. Investigators let him talk just enough to define the edges of his story, and then stopped him. Silence is a weapon. When detectives stop filling the space, the subject begins to hear themselves more clearly. The weight of what they've already said becomes heavier. Keyes began to realize something he hadn't accounted for. In the outside world, silence erased him. In this room, silence magnified him. The longer he stayed quiet, the more the unanswered questions pressed inward. The structure he had relied on, distance, movement, anonymity, no longer existed. He could not leave. He could not disappear. He could not reset. Everything was now contained in one space, and containment is where control weakens. Investigators didn't rush him. They didn't threaten. They didn't provoke. They waited. And waiting changes the power dynamic, because the person who waits controls the clock. Keyes began to understand that time was no longer his ally. He had used time to separate actions from consequences, to bury preparation years in advance, to let attention decay. But here time did the opposite. Every minute in that room collapsed distance. Every hour made the past more immediate. And with nowhere else to go mentally, his thoughts turned inward. That is where pressure builds, not from accusation, but from proximity. Proximity to his own words, to his own decisions, to the realization that the system he trusted was now being examined by people whose only job was to dismantle it. He tried to remain composed, but composition isn't permanence. Tiny changes began to surface, longer pauses, careful corrections. Moments where he stopped himself mid-thought. Not fear, calculation. And calculation, when overused, becomes visible. The room didn't break him. Didn't need to. It simply removed every place he could hide. And once that happens, the illusion of control becomes impossible to maintain. because control requires options. And in that room, there were none. There is a moment in every major investigation when understanding arrives not as relief, but as weight. For the investigators now sitting across from Israel Keyes, that moment didn't come with a confession. It came with reconstruction. As pieces were laid out side by side, travel records, timelines, fragments of admissions, something unsettling emerged. They weren't looking at a man who had been active briefly. They weren't looking at someone who escalated quickly and burned out. They were looking at someone who had planned to last. Keyes hadn't been improvising. He hadn't been reacting to circumstance. He had been preparing for years. And the most disturbing realization was not how methodical he was, but how much of that method had worked. Investigators began tracing his movements backward, not from one crime, but from many unanswered questions. Missing persons cases that had gone cold, murders that never quite fit their initial explanations. They noticed something they hadn't before: proximity. Keyes' travel placed him near incidents that had never been connected, not close enough to be obvious, not consistent enough to trigger suspicion at the time. But now, with his name attached, the distances collapsed. The map changed shape. What once looked scattered now felt deliberate, and the realization was chilling. If he had not made that single mistake, if he had not left a trace that forced attention inward, there was no guarantee he would ever have been discovered. There were no witnesses who could have identified him, no surviving victims who could describe him, no clear forensic signatures tying crimes together. The system had failed, not because it was weak, but because it was never designed to handle someone like this. Profiling assumes compulsion, patterns, escalation. Keyes had built his entire approach around rejecting those assumptions. As investigators examined the recovered kill kits, the implications deepened. Each buried container wasn't just evidence of a crime. It was evidence of intent deferred. Some kits were untouched, others showed signs of use, but there was no way to know how many had been buried or how many remained undiscovered. Each one represented a path not taken, or a crime never linked, and there would be no way to close those loops. Even as Keyes spoke, he controlled the flow of information. He admitted to some acts while withholding others. He offered partial truth without context. This wasn't bargaining, it was gatekeeping. He wanted to decide what the world would know about him, and in doing so, he denied closure. Investigators realized they were not dealing with someone who sought absolution or explanation. They were dealing with someone who wanted to preserve control even in confinement. That realization came too late to change outcomes, because by the time they understood the full scope of what they were facing, the damage was already done. Years of silence could not be reversed. Cases that had gone cold would stay that way. Families would never know exactly what happened. And the most unsettling truth settled in quietly. This wasn't a story with a clean ending. It was a story with missing pages. The realization didn't produce triumph. It produced discomfort, because law enforcement isn't built to accept uncertainty. It's built to resolve it. And here, resolution was impossible. The system had not failed to catch him quickly. It had failed to see him at all, until he chose to step into visibility. And that meant the boundary between safety and danger was thinner than anyone wanted to admit. The case forced investigators to confront something deeply unsettling: that prevention depends not just on tools and training, but on assumptions. and assumptions once exposed cannot be unlearned. They realize that if someone else adopted the same strategy, the same patience, the same discipline, the same refusal to repeat, there might be no warning signs, no escalation, no profile to follow, just absence. And absence is the hardest thing to police. When the investigation reached this stage, the question was no longer what had he done. It was how much would never be known. And that question had no answer. In the end, there was no final revelation, no comprehensive confession, no complete accounting. There was only silence, chosen, deliberate, and absolute. While in custody, Israel Keyes remained consistent in one final way. He refused to surrender control of the narrative. He spoke when it suited him. He withheld when it didn't. Investigators would later say that conversations with him felt less like interrogations and more like negotiations, with someone who believed that information itself was leverage. He offered fragments, partial timelines, vague admissions, hints that suggested far more than they confirmed, but he never opened the full ledger. There was no moment where everything spilled out, no reckoning where the past was laid bare. And then, abruptly, the opportunity for answers ended. Keyes died by suicide in his jail cell. No warning, no final statement meant for clarity. Just an ending that mirrored everything that came before it, controlled, closed, and incomplete. What he left behind were pieces, drawings, notes, symbols, things that suggested inner life without explaining it. Investigators pored over them, hoping for meaning, hoping that somewhere in the margins there might be a list, a clue, a roadmap. There wasn't. What they found instead was confirmation of something they had already begun to fear. That much of what he had done would never be fully known. The death didn't close the case, it froze it. Every unanswered question became permanent. Every gap became fixed. There would be no follow-up interviews, no clarifications, no chance to revisit contradictions. The system that had finally begun to understand him now had no subject left to examine. And that was the cruel symmetry of it. He had spent his life separating actions from consequences. Now, in death, he separated truth from resolution. For law enforcement, this was more than frustration. It was failure without remedy. Cases that might have been connected would remain isolated. Families waiting for answers would never receive them. And perhaps most unsettling of all, there was no way to be certain that everything had even been discovered. The ground keeps secrets well. Somewhere, there may still be places he prepared and never returned to. Places that look like nothing at all. No markers, no significance, just earth and silence. This is not a story about genius. It is not a story about brilliance or superiority. It is a story about discipline taken too far, and the false belief that planning can defeat inevitability. Israel Keyes did not fail because he was reckless. He failed because no one can maintain perfect control forever. Eventually, comfort replaces caution, familiarity replaces vigilance, and one small deviation is enough. The most unsettling truth is not what he did. It is how close he came to disappearing entirely, how easily the system missed him, how long absence went unnoticed, and how much of his story may still exist only as possibility, unmarked, unconnected, unresolved. Some crimes announce themselves, others fade into silence. And sometimes, the silence is the most disturbing part of all, because it reminds us that not every story ends with understanding. Some simply stop, and what remains is not closure, but the knowledge that there are things we will never fully see.
Madness